It was 326 BC on the banks of river Hydaspes that this great battle was fought between Indian King Porus and King Alexander III of Macedon, also known as Alexander the Great. Battle of Hydaspes is considered his final act, his last major victory, and also considered as one of his finest. Hydaspes, or river Jhelum, was important, as crossing it would give him passage to India, and he believed a victory and passage across India would fulfill his great desire and ambition of conquering ends of the world and great ocean. Hydaspes was regarded as Titan descendant god by ancient Greeks, and the ancient Hindu scripture Rig Veda also refers to Hydaspes as one of the holy rivers of ancient India. With such respect from both sides, it was to be expected that it would be one fight that both would give their best. The political landscape of northwestern India just before the war was very dynamic and ever-changing. The major kingdoms were Gandhara kingdom, the Pauravas ruled by Porus, and the Magad ruled by Nanda dynasty, and the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire further west. For centuries, Gandhara kingdom, which is today's Peshawar and Rawalpindi region of Pakistan, acted as a bulwark against forces from the west, which included Europeans and Persians. At its peak, it had Taxila and Kashmir region as part of its territory. The decline of Gandhara kingdom started with the rise of the Achaemenid Empire under King Darius I. Darius I annexed Gandhara and made it part of his growing Achaemenid Empire. Decline of Gandhara allowed foreign powers from west to try and enter India during this time. The Pauravas, led by King Porus, ruled the region between rivers Jhelum and Ravi, with one state between Jhelum and Chenab River and the other one between Chenab and Ravi River. After Gandhara, it was the Pauravas that were the border kingdom, and anyone who wanted to go deeper into Indian plains had to ally or take on the Pauravas to gain entry. With decline of Gandhara, Taxila or Takshashila became an independent ruled kingdom under King Ambhi. Taxila, which is in today's Rawalpindi region, was an important strategic center, and King Ambhi was on hostile terms with King Porus. Further north, region of Kashmir, which also gained independence from Gandhara, was ruled by King Abhisaras, who had a great relationship with both Porus and Alexander alike. Alexander III of Macedon ascended to the throne in 336 BC, and in the next 10 years conquered Anatolia, which is in modern-day Turkey, and defeated Persian kings in a series of war, eventually overthrowing King Darius III and conquered the great Achaemenid Empire completely. With the complete conquest of Achaemenid Empire, Gandhara was now part of the Greek territory, and that provided Alexander direct access to India. Alexander was highly ambitious, and his ambition of reaching the end of the world in great outer seas led him to borders of India. There was only one man stopping him from fulfilling his ambition, and that was King Porus. An interesting fact about King Porus is that there are no Indian records about him or his kingdom. Some historians believe him to belong to the Puru clan, which lived in the northwestern region since Vedic times. Other historians believe him to be Yaduvanshi Shurusena clan, who were part of Yadava Empire that ruled Mathura in earlier times, and migrated to northwestern Indian region in later period. Irrespective of his origins, what we do know is that he was known as wealthy, brave, and ambitious king himself, and deeply respected by his friends and foes. Battle of Hydaspes started with several behind-the-scene negotiations. Alexander sent an envoy, Cleocharis, to demand tribute and to become a vassal state of Greek Empire. King Ambhi of Taxila, in today's Pakistan region, offered to help Alexander in defeating Indian King Porus. King Ambhi offered tribute as well as offered his strong army to Alexander to use against Porus along with his network of spies and informants. This alliance helped Alexander greatly, not just militarily, but also to act as a staging ground for his foray into Porus' territory. With Porus' refusal to surrender, Battle of Hydaspes seemed imminent, and only the mighty Jhelum River separated the two forces. Historians believe that the fight was fought between May and June. This being the monsoon season, Jhelum River was overflowing, and area around it was sometimes flooded, making it difficult for movement of soldiers. Alexander gave signals of waiting out the monsoon period, even ordering large grain of shipment from Taxila king, knowing very well that this news will be picked up by Porus and will make him believe that they are in no rush to attack. Porus also believed that Alexander will wait it out for the end of monsoon to launch an attack. However, Alexander was not interested in waiting and wanted to use the element of surprise to his benefit. Porus too was preparing for the battle. He had units after units of cavalry, infantry and chariots, and his most potent weapon, and the unit Alexander's Macedonian forces had never faced before, the war elephants. The elephants, which in modern warfare would be considered like tanks, were marauding beasts who would trample anyone in front of them. With preparation completed on both sides, it was an endless waiting game. The tactical brilliance of Alexander was only about to be unleashed. Alexander wanted to keep Porus guessing. He engaged his forces in several decoy attacks to unnerve Porus's forces, and not allowing them to figure out which one would be the final attack. Each decoy attack seemed like the final one, but at the last moment, Greeks would retreat back. Alexander ordered his forces to move along the length of the river and carry out these feints and decoy attacks. Porus would also keep moving his forces to shadow these deployments. Alexander would light campfires across the river so that Porus's lookouts can see that forces are resting and not attacking. Porus kept up the mirror deployment to ensure that he catches any forays by Macedonian army at short notice. These feints seemed to be never ending, and it caused Porus to have apprehensions about Alexander's true intentions. He even believed that Alexander might just retreat back forever. Alexander had now achieved what he had initially intended to do: weaken enemy defenses and catch them off guard, and he was now about to unleash his final act of trickery that caught Porus off guard completely. In the middle of stormy night and cover of darkness, Alexander appointed his trusted general Craterus in charge of the main forces, and himself took charge of the companion cavalry units, along with his most trusted lieutenant Hephaestion, to cross the river. The crossing was done in waves across 3 points. His scouts had already identified the shallow regions to cross. And in all, around 15,000 cavalry and 11,000 infantry crossed Jhelum River. Alexander had now crossed the mighty river without anyone noticing, and waited for dawn to break for the final attack. Porus's scouts had identified the breach, but were unsure if this was the final attack or one of the many feints that had encountered over weeks, and were reluctant to pull in all the forces. In the minds of Porus's commanders, it could very well be a diversionary attack. Scouts did not know that among the units that crossed was Alexander himself. Such was the impact of trickery and feints that Porus initially believed that it was King Abyssaras of Kashmira who was coming in with reinforcements to help. Not sure if it was Alexander himself, Porus sent his own son with small force to probe. To the great surprise of younger Porus, his small unit of 3,000 cavalry and 120 chariots found itself facing the much larger and experienced Macedonian force led by Alexander himself. Porus's son, much like his father, was not ready to retreat and engaged the Macedonian units despite all odds. It was a ferocious battle, with both sides giving it their best, and casualties were high on both sides. It is believed that Alexander was himself injured, and some historians also state that his beloved and famed horse, Bucephalus, sustained serious injuries in this encounter. However, Porus's army was heavily outnumbered and outclassed with a much superior force. Porus's son, who was commanding the troops, died in the battlefield itself. With the news of death of his own son and heavy casualty, Porus realized that Alexander had indeed crossed the river, and the war had now officially begun. The two armies were now facing each other. Despite the initial losses, Porus kept a brave face and arranged his forces, keeping the ferocious elephant units in the front, with infantry right behind it. Alexander, on the other hand, put his famed Macedonian units in simple yet effective arrangements, using time-tested strategies that have won him the war against much bigger and superior forces. He saw that Porus had concentrated his forces in the center, with war elephants being at the leading edge. To counter this, he deployed the Greek infantry formation called phalanx in the center, and asked them to wait. Phalanx was a rectangular formation which used heavy infantry weapon with spears, pikes and poles to intimidate and counter any opposing infantry unit. Alexander had used them in many wars before and with a lot of success. Having placed phalanx in the center, he now carried out a classic flank attack on Porus. Alexander commanded the companion cavalry to attack the left flank, and his senior general attacked the right flank. This attack on flanks dispersed Porus's forces from the center, allowing Greek infantry and cavalry units to gain significant advantage in the center. Porus's moment of reckoning had arrived. He realized he has been tactically outsmarted with the classic pincer attack to cross the river, and now the twofold flank attack on the battleground itself. What happened next was not something that was planned. He decided to carry out the most devastating response that Greeks had ever seen. He launched a stinging attack on Greeks using his war elephants. Macedonians had never encountered war elephants of the kind they were facing now. Porus had a well-trained war elephant force, and he used them tactically. While the elephants would charge and squash anyone in front of them, he intended to use the ensuing chaos to get his infantry units, who were positioned right behind, to carry out targeted attacks. In modern warfare, this technique is seen in usage of tanks and how they provide cover for infantry units. The first round might have belonged to Alexander, but the second clearly belonged to Porus. Elephants had trampled the opposing units, and their sounds frightened the horses to run away. With wave after wave of attacks, both sides were incurring heavy casualty. The war elephants had caused a lot of damage, and the fate of battle lay in limbo. Alexander ordered his cavalry, infantry and archers to regroup. The infantry attacked the elephants from all sides, and the archers used their range to target the elephants. They had found one weakness that the elephants had. Once panicked, elephants would cause more damage to their own rather than the enemy itself. Initial flank attacks had crushed Porus's cavalry, and now the Greek regrouping was taking its toll on its elephant unit. Alexander rolled the final dice and ordered his remaining troops, who he left behind under Craterus, to cross the river for additional reinforcements. This caused further damage to the already depleted Indian forces. Alexander had deployed everything he had and hoped Porus would surrender and would have a quick end to the battle. But Porus was not one to give up. Porus was badly wounded and had lost most of the advantage that he had with elephants. Much of his cavalry, infantry and chariot units had perished, and many of them ran away fearing the worst. When most kings would have thought of surrender, Porus planned a second charge. He got hold of around 40 elephants and attacked the Greeks again. This second charge surprised Alexander and caused significant damage to the Greek cavalry. This unexpected attack killed a lot more Greek soldiers than the rounds before, and the loss of life was now taking its toll on the morale of the Greek units. Greek forces were showing signs of fatigue and unsure of how long they can take on these marauding elephant attacks. Alexander realized he was fighting a king who was proud and ambitious himself, and he would fight to the very end. He was impressed with the valor and bravery he saw in front of him. He was willing to have truce and send the brother of Taxila king for truce. This infuriated Porus even further, as he considered King Ambhi as his arch rival and traitor for siding with an outsider. Instead of truce, he was now ready to battle it out to the finish, and started regrouping his forces for another wave of attack. Eager to end the battle and have truce with Porus, he sent someone whom Porus knew very well. The Greeks called him Meros. With Meros leading the negotiation, Porus finally agreed to a negotiated truce with Alexander the Great. On being asked by Alexander how he would like to be treated, Porus answered, "Treat me as a king or treat another king." The end was bittersweet for both. For Porus, he lost a lot of his men on the battleground and suffered a lot of desertion. Historians peg the number of Indian casualties as high as 23,000 Indian soldiers, including death of Porus's own son. Porus was not only facing Alexander, but combined force of Taxila and other nearby kings who sided with Alexander. Despite these odds, he was able to maintain his own and get an honorable exit. Alexander, on the other hand, incurred heavy losses himself, with more than 1,000 of his men dead. It was the highest casualty that Macedonians had ever incurred in a battlefield. More importantly for Alexander, his forces were now openly asking for returning back to Greece after years of war. The forces realized that Porus's kingdom was tiny compared to the gigantic Nanda Empire that controlled much of northern India at that time. The idea of taking on an even bigger army, now fully prepared and ready, was simply too much to take. and there was significant unrest in his forces. Alexander took note of these and decided to return back, ending his campaign of the Far East. This ended up being his last major campaign. Porus went down in the history as the king who took on the mighty Alexander the Great, and yet survived to tell the tale. Despite such heroics, it is interesting that neither this battle or King Porus finds any mention in Indian history books of the time. While Battle of Hydaspes might have ended, it also saw rise of another great king. Meroz, who ensured truce between the two kings, was none other than Chandragupta himself. Chandragupta would go on to form the mighty Mauryan Empire, who would defeat the Nanda Empire and take control of much of India.